Well, let me start off by saying welcome to the new year. Welcome to 2026. And like so many people, we're all approaching this year with things that we want to change or something that we want to be different in ourselves and in our lives. And I know it's cliche. I know that we say it every year, but I think built into the start of every year is this redemptive quality that's available to each and every person. It's this way of God reminding us that I'm not done with you yet. And I think what is available, this redemptive quality that is available to every person, it's not just individual, but I also think it's collective. I also think it's God's way of saying to not every person, but even to every community and to every church, that there is a redemptive quality that's available for you as well, not just for things to be different, but maybe for things to be better. So what's true for every individual, even in this new year, is true for every church. So to start off this year, we are starting our very first podcast for the Indiana Conference of the United Methodist Church called One Seed at a Time. I'm Dr. J. I am the Director of Church Revitalization and New Developments. And let me just say that I am approaching these conversations and this podcast with a pastor's heart. I've been in full-time ministry for almost 20 years. And being a pastor, being someone who delivers the gospel, I am a preacher by heart. I can't turn it off when I'm at the grocery store, when I'm driving in the car. It's just who I am. I'm also a person that is passionate about developing spaces for others to grow and to use their gifts. And I am a visionary. So I bring that to these conversations. So let me begin by saying or talking about how we got here. One Seed at a Time was born out of a simple conviction, and that is leaders shouldn't have to navigate revitalization alone or without access to meaningful support. This podcast is designed to reach people right where they are, whether in rural, suburban, or urban contexts, and offer language, perspectives, and encouragement that you can use right away. One Seed at a Time is about making the work of renewal more accessible and honest. I hope to share with you some examples of the amazing work that happens when we trust God, not just with our lives, not just with our souls, but watch this, even with our churches. And it's not just to show you the amazing work, but also the honest work. Through these conversations, I want to pull back the veil about the hard realities that will come with following Christ's call for renewal. As someone who has revitalized 2 churches as a lead pastor, it was some of the most rewarding experiences in ministry I've ever had, but it was also some of the most difficult. So you might find yourself within this conversation, but I would just ask that you would open yourselves up to both the amazing work, but also be honest about the realities of the difficult work as well. So if you're watching or listening to this, I hope that you would use this as a resource for you as a leader and for your congregations. And there are ways that you can use this. If you are a leader, this is a great way to use this for your own personal reflection. I mean, none of us were called to do ministry or trained to do ministry after a global pandemic. But the reality is that as a leader, you are setting the capacity for your congregation. As a leader, they can't grow beyond your leadership capacity. So this is a great way for you to be equipped and to learn and to grow as a leader. But as leaders, we're not just called to grow as individuals, but this is a great opportunity for congregations to use to grow collectively. If you are doing small groups, this is a great opportunity to listen to the podcast as a small group and talk about some of the themes and the conversations that we'll have with different people that we will have as guests onto our show. If you don't use these as small groups, maybe at the start of your meetings, you might want to bring out some of the themes that we talk about, because in every episode, we're going to have something called show notes, that if you go right to the website, we're going to have some discussion questions and key themes, key highlights, key quotes. This will be a phenomenal time for us to gather around God's call for the Indiana Conference and beyond. It's a great way to use this as a resource so that what we offer can be accessible to your local congregation. So with all of that said, welcome to episode 1 of One Seed at a Time. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by conversations about church revitalization, this episode is for you. Today, we're laying the foundation by redefining what revitalization really means and why it matters for every church, not just for those in crisis. We'll explore the many ways renewal shows up across different contexts and begin shifting the conversation from quick fixes to faithful steps, grounded in the hope that God is still at work. So now I have to be honest with you. I stutter. I've got a speech impediment. I've never done a podcast on my own, but I think that is the beauty of ministry, and that is the beauty of our journey and walking by faith and not by sight, because perhaps you too might be called to step into something new in this season, even if it's imperfect, even if it's not how you envision it. So just start. And so because of that, we're entitling this episode of Still Holding On to Possibilities. Still holding on to possibilities. So let's begin by sharing just some of my own experiences with church revitalization. Let me offer my own stories that I will use throughout our conversations, not just for this episode, but for those after this as well. So that you not only can see my heart, but because some of this might even relate to what some of you might be going through as well. I started off as a lead pastor at the age of 27, and I remember being called to my very first church in southern New Jersey. I got the call from my district superintendent at the time. I was a graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary. I had been recognized at graduation from my work and preaching and homiletics, and I knew that God had called me to change the world. And so I was excited about the very first conversation, and I remember standing in the fellowship hall 10 minutes before a service started, and I remember looking out into the parking lot and only seeing a few cars. I'm 27, excited about ministry, and I thought the church was going to be packed. I thought hundreds from the community would show up to see this new pastor in this new community, but there was about 27 people that showed up that first Sunday. 27 people that showed up to a service where the inside of the sanctuary was painted canary yellow and teal. I'll get more about that in later episodes. 27 people that showed up to a service, and I don't know how to say this in a very nice way, but to a service that was not inspiring, to a service that was not engaging, to a service that was not relevant, with a congregation that had a history of not treating its pastors so well. We had to have mediations from the district superintendent way before I got there. This was not a congregation that had a history of growth. We were in decline for a number of years, and yet this was the place that God had called me to serve. And yet within about 4 or 5 years, the congregation became a place. It became a multicultural congregation, a place of vibrancy. We started the first Freedom School in Atlantic County, where we had as many as 70 kids for our summer Freedom School program. We started a community development corporation. We started an urban garden with about 20 beds of fresh fruits and vegetables in a community that didn't have a single grocery store. And so in light of all of that, seeing the amazing work over these next few episodes, we'll share that in the midst of the amazing work, the difficulties that accompanied that work as well. So then God called us to go to another church in northern New Jersey, St. Mark's United Methodist Church, just a few miles outside of New York City. It was one of the flagship black churches in our conferences. Bishops and district superintendents had come out of this church. It was the oldest black church in Montclair. But prior to my arrival, most of the young adult families left because the church decided to cancel the contemporary service. And needless to say, many of those families left along with their giving. So attendance had shrunk, giving had shrunk, the number of young adult families with children had shrunk. And my predecessor really believed in high church. And so this is a true story. The bulletin was 21 pages with at least 5 to 7 hymns, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there was a huge disconnect with this community because it was a place where many young professional families who worked in New York would come to move into this city. But then after about 4 or 5 years again, we did a total rebranding experience. We had to reintroduce ourselves to our community. We had to rediscover our commitment to reach young adults. We started a online and web presence within this congregation. I mean, after about 4 or 5 years, it became a different church. Our worship experience changed, our commitment to small groups. In fact, instead of calling ourselves St. Mark's United Methodist Church, we started just to use the slogan, the Mark, because we realized that for many of the community, when they heard the name St. Mark's United Methodist, when they heard the name St. Mark's, they thought it was a Catholic church. So regardless of we were in Southern Jersey or Northern Jersey, we were called into this revitalizing efforts. And then we were called to come here to the Indiana conference to serve at the largest church in our conference, St. Luke's United Methodist Church. I served as the teaching and online community pastor there for 7 years. And in that 7 years, we saw some amazing things. We were seeing about 3,500 people on a Sunday morning before COVID with 5 services. Every Sunday, there were 300 kids and youth. And yet after COVID, watch this, after COVID, 50% of our worshiping community was worshiping online. So whether we were at the small church in Southern New Jersey or the high-functioning church in Northern New Jersey, or being here in Indiana, there was always this call of rediscovering and revitalization. And I say that because I want to redefine it. Let's redefine church revitalization, and let's use this definition. Church revitalization is the intentional spirit-led practice of renewing a church's purpose, practices, or vision so that it can faithfully participate in God's mission in its current context. Let's break apart that definition. It has to be intentional. Revitalization has to be intentional. It's not accidental and it's not reactive. It's not reactive to just a shrinking congregation, but it is the result of strategic, somebody say strategic. It is the result of strategic decisions about direction, strategic decisions about leadership, about worship, strategic decisions about the audience that God is calling you to reach, strategic decisions about discipleship. And because our decisions have to be strategic, that means that revitalization, by definition, it is a choice. It's not something that we do accidentally. It's not something that we just pray for and hope that it happens, but it is the result of the choices and the decisions that we make. Revitalization also has to be spirit-led. Let me say this to you, that at the center of our work of revitalization, it is our intentional decision to place God at the center. It doesn't matter if you are the small church, the medium-sized church, or the larger church with tons of services. and you see thousands of people on a Sunday morning. The work of revitalization is a faith journey for leaders and the congregation. You must place God at the center. In fact, good luck trying to do the work of revitalization and the work that God is doing in your community without placing God at the center. And it's going to be tempting because in the work of revitalization, we often place budgets at the center. We often place good ideas at the center. We often place what other churches are doing at the center. We often place fear or desperation at the center. We might place the fear of decline or the desperation of reaching new kinds of people, and those might be a motivating factor, but at the center, it has to be God's will. It has to be God's will. There's nothing like standing in front of a congregation of 27 people and looking all of them in the eyes and telling them that God is calling this congregation to meet the needs of the declining literacy rates in the community by starting a freedom school for 50 kids in the summer that'll cost $50,000, that it will have to be trained by a local organization in Washington, D.C., that will be one of the biggest projects that you've done in years, with a pastor that has never written grants before, with a building that doesn't even house the 50 kids, but walking by faith and not by sight, not by fear of the kids that you don't have or fear of the worship attendance declining, or by desperation, but walking out because of what you believe that God has called you to do. It is placing God at the center. It's not only spirit-led, but is also a practice by definition of renewing purposes, practices, and vision. Revitalization goes deeper than attendance or programs. It's not about what God is calling us to do, but it's about being challenged by wondering, who is God calling us to be? And as we answer the question, who God is calling us to be, is who God is calling us to be in this current, somebody say current, in this current context. Revitalization honors change, and churches must listen to that change. So pre-COVID is not current. Your glory days is not current. So we must ask the question, who is here now? And who is God calling us to reach today and tomorrow? Let's go back to the definition. Church revitalization is the intentional, spirit-led practice of renewing a church's purpose, practices, or vision so that it can faithfully participate in God's mission in its what? In its current context. So what does this mean? This means that every church, whether you're growing, plateaued, declining, or thriving, will face moments where it must rediscover who it is and why it exists. It is okay to rediscover, because you are not the same church that you were before 2020. Think of it like this. We're always rediscovering who we are as individuals. We're not the same person as we were in our 20s. We're not the same person as we were in our 30s. I will be 43. No, I think I'll be 40. Let me ask my wife next time. I will be 43 or 44 on my next birthday. I'm not the same person. I won't be the same person when my kids go off and they live on their own. I won't be the same person when my kids have their own children. I won't be the same person when I retire. At every stage and every season of our lives, we're always invited to rediscover who we are. Faith is about rediscovering. We rediscover our callings. We rediscover who we believe God to be. And the same rediscovery that is available to us as individuals, it's also important for us to rediscover who we are as a faith community, because God is always calling us to new things in new seasons in our lives, because growing churches consistently rediscover themselves. Let me say that again. Growing churches consistently rediscover themselves, because revitalization is the intentional, spirit-led practice of renewing a church's purpose, practices, or vision so that it can faithfully participate in God's mission in its current context. So let's look at 6 different ways that revitalization often shows up, or 6 different ways that might invite a church to go through a process of revitalization and rediscovery. Because as you will find, and as you'll see, it's not just always with the church that is in crisis. First way, I want to call same gospel, new faces. And that's when a church goes through a process of revitalization or rediscovery, when they have to reach a new audience. Again, not by declining, but through a process of looking more like its community. And this often happens when a church realizes that the surrounding community has changed. When the people that used to live around the community, that they are no longer present in those surrounding neighborhoods. Is when the church is faithful but no longer accessible to the new people that have moved in that community. I mean, the gospel has changed, but who needs to hear it and how it has to be delivered? It's when the church looks different than the community. When you look at the people in the pews and you walk around or go to some of the stores in the community, when there's a disconnect between the people who are in the pews and the people in the community, man, that is an intentional time for a church to commit to revitalization and to rediscover who they might be. Because this kind of revitalization asks the questions, who lives here now that we're not reaching? It asks the questions, what barriers, cultural, generational, racial, economic, standing in the way of us reaching those demographics? And what new expressions of worship or discipleship or community investments might be needed? This isn't about abandoning current members, but it's about expanding the circle. Revitalization often yields itself through growing pains, or growth requires discovery. Have you ever walked into an elevator and there's the sign that often says maximum weight or maximum persons? What they're letting you know is that there's a certain limit to this elevator. There's a certain limit. There's a certain capacity to this space. And the reality is that everything has a capacity. You have a capacity as a leader. The building that you are situated in, it has a capacity. Every congregation has a capacity. Regardless of its size, every congregation is designed to meet the needs of the numbers that are currently present. And yet sometimes revitalization is needed, not because the church is struggling, but because it's growing, because you've reached capacity. Some of the signs might include your attendance or your participation is outpacing your systems. The systems that you have for discipleship, the systems that you have for planning worship, the systems that you have for outreach, the systems that you have for congregational care, they are just no longer meeting the needs of your current congregation, because you were designed and you are operating from a certain capacity. And once you reach that capacity, you realize that there were some gaps and difficulties that you are now experiencing, not because there's anything wrong, not because you're doing anything wrong, but it's because you've reached capacity. And sometimes volunteers begin to burn out. Informal leadership is no longer working. The idea of we've always done it this way, it's now becoming a bottleneck. One of the major decisions that I had to make, especially at my second congregation when we began to grow, was that we had to change the way that we did congregational care. I was not the only person that could visit people in the hospital room. We had to change our systems. So Growing is a way that invites us to revitalization. And it's not just growing, but understanding that ministry happens beyond the building, or hybrid ministry revitalization is what many churches discovered during the pandemic. People are gathering in more than one place now. Formation and reach doesn't just happen in the buildings. Now, I just launched a book called Not Just Sundays, where we look at the many places and opportunities that we have for reaching people beyond the building, because hybrid revitalization includes integrating digital worship and in-person communities. It includes creating on-demand discipleship and learning potential and possibilities. It is seeing online participants as part of the church and not less than. The hybrid ministry isn't a phase. It's a reality that churches must learn to steward, not only today, but to tomorrow. In my work as the online campus pastor at St. Luke's United Methodist Church, sometimes on a Sunday morning, 50% of our worshiping community, they were worshiping online. We couldn't do things in the same way anymore. It was an invitation for revitalization in response to hybrid ministry, in a response of reaching people beyond the building. It's also the idea of one church and many expressions, and that is revitalization through launching new campuses or site. Because sometimes the healthiest next step isn't to grow in just one room. And listen, I understand the temptation. I told you, I come at this with the pastor's heart. There is nothing more fulfilling than walking into a space and it's packed and it's filled and there's energy, especially with the churches that I've served, in the preaching moment, in the music, there's voices and there's singing. There's nothing like walking into a sanctuary or a Bible study and it is packed. But remember, one church, many expressions. Sometimes the healthiest next step isn't to grow in just one room, but it's to multiply the spaces. And that invites us to a process of revitalization. It might include understanding that sometimes the way that we reach people is not inviting them to just that one space, but it is the church moving into those spaces where people already are. That might show up in terms of multi-sites or multi-campus models or new worshiping communities or fresh expressions. This type of revitalization asks, where is God already at work and how can we join? Or we might release rather than centralize. And I know that's hard. I know we love packed rooms, but we might release rather than centralize. Or how do we replicate the DNA into the different spaces, not just the programs? Because multiplication is often a sign of renewal and not division. Or we revitalize when we move back to the why, when we reclaim our purpose and focus. Because some churches don't need more programs, but what they need is more clarity. In fact, one of the greatest gifts that God gives to leaders, that God gives to communities, that God gives to churches, it is not more money, it is not more people, it is not more stuff, but one of the greatest gifts that God gives us in different seasons of our lives, it is direction and clarity. And this shows up when ministries have multiplied without a sense of alignment. Everybody is busy and everybody is serving, but there's no alignment. There is no synergy. There's a lot of energy, but the energy is scattered. And the leaders and volunteers, they're active, but they're not fulfilled. And this revitalization centers on re-articulating the mission and the vision. There's a great book called Mission Drifts, where it lays out this idea that even for the best of churches and the best of organizations, sometimes we tend to drift from our original purpose that we set out at our origins. And it happens to the best of churches. And it doesn't matter, regardless of your size, whether you are a small congregation or congregation that sees hundreds or thousands of people on a Sunday morning, that sometimes the invitation for revitalization is to get back to your why. It is to find and to rediscover your own purpose and rediscover your own direction and your own clarity. Because clarity is often the most compassionate form of leadership that we can offer to communities and congregations. And sometimes, even when it's not clarity, sometimes revitalization just happens because we are in new seasons and times are changing. I mean, this can include like navigating these cultural and generational and demographic shifts. So many congregations that I've connected with are different after disaffiliations. They're not the same congregations. And guess what? That's okay, because the same ways that people change, congregations change. You are not the same congregation anymore, and the word in which we are called to go continues to evolve. So this type of congregation asks, what changes in our community can we no longer ignore? Because when the culture starts to change, so does the way that we do ministry. And you don't have to be a declining congregation or congregation in crisis to begin a process of revitalization and rediscovery. Because growing congregations, they do what? They consistently rediscover themselves over and over and over again. And we're going to bring some different leaders onto this podcast to show you what that looks like. Because the challenge is that many leaders think that revitalization only looks one way, and that's where misconception creeps in. In fact, there's some of you that think, listen, my congregation is growing, I don't need this. But listen, I would beg to differ, because the process of rediscovery isn't just for the congregation that's declining. Because remember, we're placing God at the center. And if the world around us is changing, and if the world around us is revitalizing, so too must your congregation. So here are some misconceptions that are often here when people think about revitalization, right? What do people often think? That revitalization is only for dying churches, or they think that revitalization means to change everything. I never forget when a couple that I loved dearly in my second congregation just finally said to me and said, Pastor, are you going to throw the baby out with the bathwater? And we had made some changes that they didn't like, and they had vowed to go to another dying congregation right down the street. But it was this idea of when we revitalize, do we have to throw out everything? But here's the reality. Revitalization, it will invite us to change something. I mean, I would love to tell you that your congregation will look differently in this new year, that you'll do some phenomenal things and some amazing work, and invite you to change nothing about your congregation. But that just doesn't happen. It's not biblical. Even in the Gospel of John, it reminds us that God cuts off things that doesn't bear fruit, and even those things that are bearing fruit, God prunes. So there's no way that I can tell you that in the midst of rediscovery and revitalization, that there won't be some things that you'll have to change. You know, some of the things that, some of the misconceptions that revitalization happens quickly. That if we just make one decision with a silver bullet, that'll change everything overnight. I wish I could tell you that seeds grow like that, but they don't. Some people think that revitalization is just a copy and paste from another church. If it worked for them, then it's got to work for us. I would love to tell you to just copy and paste, but it doesn't work like that, because if you're placing God at the center, remember, it's a faith journey. Some people think that we can't afford it. You're looking at the budget, but let me remind you, you can't afford not to. Because if you're really believing in God's provision, God will give you the finances and the money and the provision to be the kind of congregation that God has called you to be. And I know some of you are thinking we don't have the right leaders, we don't have the right skills, but remember, you're called to make disciples and to equip disciples. If Jesus could change the world with 12 people who knew nothing about discipleship, you are in a much better place. Which is why we're calling this one seed at a time. Because it's not about Hail Marys or hoping for the best. It's not about an answer to survive for another year. It's not about another program. And it's not about a walk of certainty, but a walk of possibility. Not something that happens overnight, but something that happens one seed at a time. It's something that happens when we hold on to possibilities. In fact, I want to end every episode with a devotional. And the scripture that grounds our approach simply comes from Matthew 13, the parable of the sower. It's when Jesus is telling this parable about a farmer who's going out to plant seeds, and it's a story that many of us know, often framed around soil types or outcomes. But before any of that, there's a simple, powerful image that we don't always linger on. We just move right past it, that the farmer goes out to sow, simply relying on what's possible. Because before the seed ever touches the ground, the farmer is holding what? The farmer's holding seeds. The farmer's holding possibility in the farmer's hands. There's no guarantee, just what's possible. No visible harvest, no forest to point to, just seeds, just holding on to what's possible. And in many ways, isn't that the posture of faith? Because the farmer doesn't wait until he can see the fruit. The farmer doesn't wait until she holds back. She doesn't hold back because some seed might fall on rocky ground or among the thorns, but she goes out and she sows anyway, trusting that possibility is worth releasing even when the outcomes are uncertain. And I wonder if that's an invitation for us today. Because it's easy to hold on to possibilities when we can already see the fruit. But it's harder when the fields feel tired, when the ground feels resistant, when the harvest seems distant or invisible. It's easy to let go of hope when we don't yet have the fruit to show for our faithfulness. But there may be somebody listening right now who is ready to let go of some possibilities in your life. There might be a leader who's exhausted, a congregation that's weary, a church that's wondering if the effort is still worth it because the fruit seems distant and invisible. And if that's you, be encouraged. Because the parable reminds us that faithfulness does not begin with certainty. It simply begins with seeds of possibility. Because the farmer's role is not to control the soil or guarantee the outcome, but the farmer's role starts with the courage to simply hold on and believe what's still possible. So all you have right now is small seeds, that's enough. If all you can offer is a faithful next step, that's enough. Because if God is still at work, you'll never know what can grow when you simply hold on to what's possible. So as we wrap up this first episode, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. And even for those of you who are watching, thanking you for being part of this space as well. Because today we simply try to reframe what we mean by revitalization, naming the many ways of renewal, revival, and rediscovery can take shape, and grounding this work in the simple but powerful conviction of what's still possible. So if something resonated with you, I encourage you to take a few moments to explore the show notes. You'll find key ideas, reflection prompts, and resources designed to help you to continue the conversation in your own context. And in our In our next episode, we'll go deeper by unpacking some of the things that we rarely talk about church revitalization, the challenges, the tensions, and the realities that leaders often face in silence. We'll also begin exploring the theology that undergirds our beliefs about renewal, hope, and faithful change. So wherever you're listening from, I just thank you for showing up today. So until next time, keep holding on to possibility, taking the next faithful steps, and remember that whatever it is, it's still possible if you just keep holding on to it. So until next time, until episode 2, may the Lord bless you and keep you real good. See you next time.